for Jewish Studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all today for Last Train to Auschwitz, the French National Railways, and the Journey to Accountability with Professor Sarah Federman from the University of San Diego. Our talk today is part of a 2-year Man Distinguished Symposium focused on Jewish leadership. And we thank Tom and Diane Mann for their support of this series, which is so integral to our programming. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Robin Judd in Ohio State's Department of History, who will be introducing Professor Federman and moderating the talk today. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much. It is such an unbelievable pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Federman to our campus today, albeit remotely. Dr. Federman is an associate professor of conflict resolution at the University of San Diego Kroc School of Peace Studies, she studies the intersection of business and mass atrocity. Dr. Federman is the author of the award-winning Transformative Negotiation Strategies for Everyday Change and Equitable Futures, and the award-winning Last Train to Auschwitz, the French National Railways, and the Journey to Accountability. She's also co-authored 2 anthologies, and in 2022, she testified before Congress concerning the responsibility of U.S. banks to respond to their slavery ties. Federman comes to all of this work after a decade as an international advertising executive working in over 10 countries with companies such as Google, Discovery, and the NFL. So we can talk to her too about the sort of multiple journeys and pathways that leaders take and what that means. Let me hand the floor over to Dr. Federman and sort of set out, before I do so, how today will work. She is going to speak for however long she speaks, 40 minutes or so. And then you can ask your questions in the Q&A. I will be checking that box. And so if a question pops in your head, feel free to put it in as quickly as it does, but I won't ask the questions until the end. And I especially encourage our History 3676 students to think about questions and ask questions. I will hand the floor over to Dr. Federman. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, please do, as I'm talking, ask questions about any aspect of this, the personal journey, the people, the trains. There's so much in this. I really appreciate the opportunity to come together right now, even on Zoom. I have to imagine your faces, but there's just a lot going on in the world, and the coming together, doing it together really helps. I mean, if you're a young person coming out into this world, trying to figure out where you're going to make your contribution, there's a lot of questions there, and for your teachers and others as well. So thank you for coming. This is still a really important topic in that, how is it that people come to do these terrible things? They participate in these atrocities that they had no intention of ever participating in. I mean, nobody becomes a railway worker because they plan to take people to their death. I mean, that's not the plan. It's not the bucket list. So I'm going to take you a little bit through the book and then have your questions. I'm very eager to hear your responses. So the book, Last Train to Auschwitz, I'll tell you sort of how I came to write it. And some of you who've read the book, and that's amazing, you got to meet some of these amazing survivors and others. It's taught me a lot of lessons about how corporations end up participating in mass atrocity. And we have this all around us today in many different sectors. And I'm writing another book focused on helping executives make better decisions. So I can talk about that as well. All kinds of corporations have participations in genocide. Some aren't as lethal as driving a train. But in the case of the Holocaust, Hugo Boss was, fitting the Nazis with these very fashionable uniforms, and they did very well in the war. Hugo Boss himself was a Nazi, and that brand sort of goes on and is quite strong today. They actually have really beautiful clothes, but a very painful history. And there's other brands like Porsche, and Bayer Aspirin came out of IG Farben, which is the one that created the gas for the gas chambers in the Holocaust. As uh, um, as we mentioned before, I had actually an advertising career before I started studying this. Some of you, it sounds like some of you are already interested in history in this way. I'd studied history undergrad, but I didn't follow it up immediately. So I was based in Manhattan. I was working with these different companies, like our company would sell to these different companies. So I got to go meet the people and sell the products and so on. Um, and then they transferred me to Paris because they had bought a French company and I spoke French and had a passport and didn't have kids. So off I went. And most of the time I spent just enjoying Paris, enjoying Europe. I mean, if anybody wants to transfer you to Paris, you just say yes. But after a while, the joys of Europe started to give way to like the darker past and the intensity of the world wars. And that culminated for me. I was rollerblading along the Seine. I don't know if anybody's spent time in Paris, but they close one of the roads along the Seine on Sundays so you can bike and rollerblade. And so I was done rollerblading and I went to the Marais, which is the Jewish neighborhood, because they're the only place open on Sunday for lunch. A lot of the other places are closed. So the Jewish neighborhood's open. And I passed this Holocaust memorial and I just wanted to see if there were any Federmans that had been deported. I knew like I would just have a common last name, but I really did not expect to see my own name. Uh, that was really haunting. Just this feeling that, oh, wow, okay, if I had been here 70 years ago, this would have been me on this train. And I couldn't find out much about her. All they knew was that she was Polish descent and was murdered at 16. So that turned my attention a little bit away from my corporate job. And I just thought, oh God, like we can't do this again to anybody. And I remembered something my history teacher had said. So your history professors, your professors might put a little thought in your brain that starts to grow over time. And I'm sure your professors are doing that a lot for you. But when I left for Paris, one of them had said to me, one of my old history professors, we became friends after college. He said, hey, find out if those train drivers actually kept their jobs after the war. He meant the ones that drove those deportation trains. So all those names that you were seeing on the walls in Paris, they were all taken by train to Auschwitz. And most of the deportees were all taken by train. Just to give you a sense of it, Auschwitz had 42 parallel tracks, just Auschwitz alone. And the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum actually, it's about now 15 years ago, came out with a map and saying actually there were 50,000 camps, just to give you a sense of that, both work and death camps. But the question for me after seeing my name and remembering this request made by my friend is I wanted to know what exactly did the French National Railways do in the war, which the French National Railways is also known as the SNCF. So if you've been to Paris and you've traveled around France on a train, you've taken the SNCF. And does the contemporary company, depending on its role in the Holocaust, need to atone in any way? And how does a company atone? Some of you may have seen that President Biden just apologized for the US role in the indigenous residential schools. So, this approach of apologizing. Does a train company apologize? Do other companies apologize? And that's their logo, just in case it jogs your memory if you've seen it. So when I started this research, I didn't really know what thread I was pulling on, actually. And one of the survivors I had just sort of run into early on in my research said, I hope you know what you're up to, Sarah, because this subject is très délicat. It's very delicate. The SNCF, c'est la France, right? The SNCF is France. And I love this picture because it shows how the railway lines are like the veins of the country. There's no company in the United States that is quite connected to the national identity anywhere close the way the SNCF is. So there's a lot of pride. So to start digging into their wartime history and finding some dark chapters is not a popular journey. Those of you who have read the book may have remember this, and those who just are a little rusty on your history, I just wanted to remind you that early on in World War II, the Germans occupied France, and there was initially an occupied zone that's in kind of pink peach here, and then a free zone. So where the French government was seated, so you can see Vichy there, de facto seat of government. The Vichy government collaborated with the Nazis, but the people living in the South were not under the same level of control as those in the north. Eventually, the whole country was occupied. When I first began this research, I was not, I mean, I had history undergrad, but I was not a trained historian in any academic sense. So I started going to just the archives all over Paris. One, that's the Holocaust Museum. Went to Sciences Po, which is a French university, the National Archives. The SNCF has an archives. I went to memorials. I even started skipping work. I realized I just was so absorbed in the archives. I got a call one day from my boss saying, where are you? I was like, oh, I guess I'm in the archives. I probably should go to work. But I almost wish this for each of you, that like some topic, something grabs you so much that you just can't stop but chasing it. Then I realized I also needed to talk to Jewish leaders and other leaders in France to understand the role of the French National Railways in the war. This is Guillaume Pepi. He's the chairman of SNCF. Luckily, one of my classmates had a husband who worked in the rail business, and so she helped me sneak into a train conference and meet him. So I was able to give him my card and then get connected to the SNCF. They were wonderful and allowed me to interview them many times. The head of the French Jewish leadership. And then on the bottom right is Serge Klarsfeld, who's a famous Nazi hunter, who is the leading Holocaust activist in France. In the United States, we don't have quite the same thing, but in France, he basically runs how Holocaust is understood. And I can talk more about him. So meeting these extraordinary people, getting all these different opinions, and then those of you who've had a chance to read it, got a sense of some of the people that I met. I had just wanted to interview some Holocaust survivors. I did not need to interview 90, but so many wanted to talk to me and responded to my messages that I sent out through the Holocaust Museum that I spoke to them all. So these are some of those that are on the last train. At the end of each chapter, I actually say what's happening with these individual people who are on the last train from Paris to Auschwitz as I tell the story about the railway. So that's just my research methods for those of you who are students. I did the archives. I talked to people who are experts. I talked to archivists. Ended up also interviewing lawyers, ambassadors, so many different people. But the Holocaust survivors are the really ones who gave me a lot of, spoke to me about a lot of things about the train company, but a lot of things that are helping me navigate this time today. And I can share that with you. What I found as a result of doing this research, and why research is so delicious, is that the more I studied the railway, the more I was unsure what it was during the war. The company had 500,000 employees. Just to give you a sense, that's more than all US airlines combined right now. And Amtrak Railway in the United States only has 17,000 employees. Okay, so the SNCF during World War II had 500,000. Today they have 250,000. They don't need as many because of they don't use coal, but it's still 250,000 people. And those 500,000 people were doing all different things during the war. So this is really informative for us when we think about corporations, because not the whole corporation necessarily is doing the same thing at the same time. And it's difficult to find where's the soul of the corporation. So I'm going to take you through these overlapping roles. So how would we understand the French National Railways as a victim in World War II? Well, one, the SNCF did not start World War II. It was not their idea, and they were not particularly thrilled that the Germans had come into France and requisitioned their railways. So the railway was overseen by German engineers during the war. And this is a picture of some destruction. Their railways were destroyed during the war, right? It was wartime. This was not good for them. Hugo Boss made a lot of money during World War II. The SNCF did not make money. Their railway workers were deported. They were under German rule, which they did not like, because the railway workers in French are called cheminots. They had more connection to each other. It was like railway first, and then underneath country. So I was told you have read some works about unionization and in the civil rights movement and Black workers. And I don't know in those unions if they had quite that identity, but it was really for the SNCF, railway first, then country. So being under the German rule was horrific for them. Many of their trains were destroyed and they had great attachment to their trains. The Germans never paid what they were billed. So I found these invoices in the archives that showed that the Germans never paid, which meant that it was hard for the railway to keep running. Many of their railway workers were deported to other parts of Europe to do work for the Germans. And of course, some were killed. It was just a very dangerous time. So if we look at the company through this lens, like this was not, they were a victim of the war. Then they also, the story that circulates in France now, so I hope some of you will get to France and ask people about the role of the railways during the war, but do it gently. You'll probably get this story about railway workers and how important they were in their resistance. Some of them did assist deportees who were deported. There's reports of slowing trains. And the most famous is that they helped sabotage, some of them helped sabotage trains on D-Day. So when the Allies were landing in Normandy, the French National Railways, workers were bombing the train tracks so that their own trains couldn't get there filled with German soldiers and German armaments. So that helped the Allies get a landing. So that was really important. There's a film on YouTube. You can see La Bataille de Rail. I'll show you a picture of that, the Battle of the Rail, so you can watch that they claim has some footage from that, original footage from that heroism. The people involved in these heroic acts were probably about less than 0.5% of the company, but this is the identity that the company talks about now. But then, of course, the SNCF also was a villain in World War II. The company helped transport 76,000 deportees to the German border, where another train driver then took them to Auschwitz. As you can see in this photo, they are not being put into passenger cars. They are crammed into what we now call cattle cars. They had different names during the war. And you can see the logo on the right side of the photo. It says France SNCF. So if you go to a Holocaust museum, you'll likely see their name on railcar pictures because their trains were used all over Europe. So that's the people were in horrific conditions. Some of the people I talked to and the memoirs I read said that the rail journey was worse than Auschwitz. We can talk about that. There was no evidence of resistance in the archives from the executives. They resisted when the Germans wouldn't pay them the full amount, but they never seemed to resist this. And of course, there were a number of archives that were burned after the war. They were trying to cover their tracks, but you wouldn't burn archives showing that you stood up to the Germans. So, they likely did not. And they did not protect the Jewish employees. And if you remember that I showed you that occupied and unoccupied zone, you could have sent all the Jewish employees down to the free zone, and that would have protected them, but they did not do that. In fact, they helped the Germans. They reported to the Germans any of railway workers that were trying to sabotage the trains. And I want to highlight this overlapping role in times of conflict. I also teach a lot of conflict resolution and talk about world conflicts that we're facing today. It's very easy to get into simplified narratives of us and them, and this group was horrible and this group is good. But the railway story really helps us grapple with there's overlapping roles that organizations and people can play during a war. What's really interesting when you look at history is which identity endures over time. So why did the SNCF's identity as hero during World War II is the one that lasted, not the one of victim and not the one of perpetrator, even though there were only about less than 0.5%, or maybe if you're generous, 1%, maybe people we didn't know, were in the resistance of those 500,000. Well, there was a decision. After World War II, the French pride was so decimated from that occupation that the government worked with the SNCF, de Gaulle worked with the SNCF, and they decided that the train company would be a site of national pride. They would rebuild the whole country's pride on this railway. And so they helped fund this movie, La Bataille du Rail, which I mentioned is on YouTube if you want to watch it, about that heroic day that some of the workers stopped the trains from getting to Normandy so that the Allies could land. That critical role. And it was. I don't want to minimize that. The SNCF was also given this medal from the Legion of Honor, the medal called the Legion of Honor for their role in the resistance. This is very interesting. It's a bad photo because I took it in their building. They had it in the lobby. And this is basically suggesting that because less than 1% of the railway workers were in the resistance, that the whole company gets to take on the identity of hero. But again, this was a strategic move on the government's part to help build national pride. But the other thing that was helping for a while is that the Cold War was happening. And no one was going to go after this perpetrator chapter while the Cold War was happening, because there was so much fear of the USSR that no one wanted to challenge Germany or Switzerland for their roles in World War II. And so the unfinished Holocaust business did not move forward until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then I know in your history class, you're also studying race in America, and it's very interesting. You know, George Floyd's murder created another opening for other things to happen as well. So there are political moments that change how we understand history. So once the Soviet Union collapsed, now all these invoices that I found and individuals who were affected by the deportations and the SNCF's role in the deportations started to speak up. Kurt Schechter on the top right, he sued the SNCF for 1 symbolic euro in the 1990s. He just wanted them to acknowledge that they had a role in the deportations. He had been deported, I believe. His father was deported. And the SNCF put up a plaque where his father was deported, and he dropped the lawsuit. But below, you can see Alain Lippietz, who was also the head of the French Green Party. You can see his fierce eyes. He was less willing to drop his lawsuit and sued the SNCF and almost won on behalf of his father. In France, they don't have class action lawsuits, so everybody would have to sue the company individually. So there was this real reckoning that was starting to happen in the 90s. And the SNCF did step up, and I want to tell you what they did, because I think what they did is important for other companies. They did open their archives. They're a national company, so they had archives to open, so you can go visit their archives. They had somebody study their history independently of them, and then they made that available. It's only available in French right now, but it's available. Then they had a colloquium where they revised their history. They did something we call narrative braiding, where they braided the history of victimhood with the history of perpetration, with the history of heroism. So all of those stories could be true. Then they've started making contributions to Holocaust education, and even made an apology in 2010. Now, they were dragged into this, let's be clear. They weren't excited about it, but the lawsuits dragged them in, and they didn't pay the survivors directly. So this is what they were critiqued for, that they took people against their will and they should pay. But I do want to say that a number of the survivors that I met, and they're in the book, mentioned in the book, did really appreciate these efforts. So here's Renee on the left. She's speaking at a reading of the names that she did the day we met, which the SNCF helped. They helped fund that every year. And here's Lillian Martin in front of a plaque from where her father was taken. I think it's a very dreary memorial. It needs a little more upkeep, but at least they help contribute to monuments like this. Then something else happened in 2013, which was an interesting twist in the story. While the SNCF is trying to deal with these Holocaust claims, they end up signing a contract with Israel. And so they now provide some of the rail, I don't know if they do the actual whole trains. They do many different aspects of the rail business, but they now help with the National Railway in Israel. So there was an idea of, okay, well, now Israel's working with them. So I think it's the conflict must sort of be over, and the SNCF must have made amends for the Holocaust. And then something else happened that put this to bed, which was France's High Court. It's the Conseil d'État, which is the Supreme Court of France. It actually said no more World War II cases. You cannot sue us anymore for World War II, so no more SNCF cases. Their argument was, listen, there's lots of compensation programs now. We've done the best that we can. Because there's no class action lawsuit, everybody has to sue individually, and it's just an administrative nightmare. So if you can imagine sort of a court closing and saying, we're done. And that sort of put an end to anybody who felt that the SNCF still needed to do more or needed to pay. So you'd think it's over. So in France, that was the attempt to end it, right? So the SNCF apologized. It made itself transparent. It now has an agreement with Israel. It's closed the courts. It didn't close the courts, but the courts closed. But it's really hard to lock history away. As those of you history students know, those skeletons in the closet do come back to haunt you. A lawsuit was launched out of New York, and they say on behalf of 600 survivors, but I never got that verified, that actually to sue the SNCF, saying that they needed to do more to make amends. But you can't actually sue the SNCF from New York because the SNCF is a national railroad. And there is something called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act that keeps individuals in the United States from suing any country. So you cannot sue countries, and the SNCF as a national railway claimed, sorry, we're national, you can't sue us. The lawyers knew this, they're not dumb, but they were doing it to attract attention to this situation. And they got a lot of articles written in the Washington Post, Atlantic, also in France and Le Monde, about this railway that they felt like did not fully atone for its role in these deportations. This is where it gets interesting for the United States, because you think, okay, this is all happening in France, right? No, what ended up happening is the SNCF is an extraordinarily good rail company. So as a train company, they're on par with Shinkansen, which is the Japanese rail company. And so in the United States, I didn't know this until I did the research, our railway contracts are other companies bid for them. So Amtrak doesn't automatically get everything. So the SNCF bids for regional rail. It bids for high speed, which we don't yet have, but we keep saying that we're going to get. But the SNCF, excuse me, had was vying for contracts in Massachusetts, which it got the biggest Massachusetts state contract in the history of the state, but Virginia, Maryland, Florida, and California. So in every one of those states, except for Massachusetts, survivors and their supporters advocated for legislation that would keep the company out of the United States until it did atoned for its role in the Holocaust. So I started chasing this because now I was back in the United States and I was able to chase this fascinating debate. What did the SNCF need to do to be able to do business in the United States? Maryland was the only one who passed this legislation. So that's Governor O'Malley, who ran for president briefly last time around. And here's Leo Breatholtz. He's the one, if you read the book, who jumped out of a moving train when he was a teenager. It was the train headed to Auschwitz. He got out and he ended up in Maryland running a bookstore and living sort of a quiet life until somebody discovered his Holocaust history and kind of dragged him into the SNCF debate. But he was able to get Governor O'Malley to sign legislation that said the company had to make all of its archives available before it did business in Maryland. So that's what ended up happening. The SNCF digitized its archives and then tried to bid for what's called the MARC contract, the MARC train. It didn't win, but it did go for that. So this is it. Now you can go online. There's not much in the archives about the Jews or the deportations, of others, of anyone, because those were destroyed. But symbolically, it's up, and you can poke around. Okay, so now is it over? Like, they've digitized the archives. Governor O'Malley passed that legislation. Again, the conflict kept going. Because if any of you have been to DC, you might notice may see this purple line on the top and know it's new. I don't think they've finished it yet. Maybe someone can tell me during the Q&A. I didn't see it last time I was there. But there was this new rail project happening on the DC Metro line. And the SNCF, through its US division, bid for it. And this time the survivors, this is a hybrid project because this part of Maryland is part of DC and Maryland. So it was a hybrid national and local state project. And the survivors in Maryland said, no purple line for the SNCF unless they pay us. We want reparations. Well, this escalated the conflict to a whole new level because it's basically survivors asking France to pay them reparations, which is not going to happen because this is what the State Department wants to do. This is their job. So we had the Maryland got involved, legislature of Maryland, the US House of Representatives got involved, and the Department of State got involved. Now saying, okay, now we need to put this conflict to bed because this is now hurting French-US relations. And I spoke with these ambassadors who were negotiating the deal, trying to figure out how could they put this to bed and satisfy everyone enough so folks could move on. And some survivors were feeling really emphatic. They did not want this railway in their state. So this is Rosette Goldstein. She never wanted to see the railway in her state of Florida because, she said the company never lifted a finger to help the Jews. Why would I want that company in my state, see that train rolling by? Leo, the one who jumped out of the train, became very adamant that he didn't want them until they offered full transparency and apology and compensation. But that wasn't shared by everybody. This is what's so great about doing interviews. And I hope that any research you do, you get to interview lots of people because you'll see the differences. This is Manfred. He's a survivor who lives in LA. And sorry, he said, didn't come up on the thing, but he said, I don't know. I feel like it's looking like for a perpetrator now that the real perpetrator is dead. Because the survivors I was interviewing were all kids during the war. That means the people who drove these trains, the executives, they're all dead. I mean, if you're going after the train company, they're not there anymore. You can go after the money and symbolically, but he didn't feel that made any sense. Then we have Daniel Erzbettel. So you've read about him in the book too, him and his brother. His feeling was like, I don't know, like they worked under constraint. The train drivers didn't have, an opportunity to do something else. So I didn't have opportunity to do something else at Auschwitz. I had to like carry bodies and do terrible things. So I don't know. I'm not so sure we should make them pay. Others were like, why would we punish the taxpayers of today for the deeds of their parents? So it was a real mix, they didn't all agree. But still, as I was doing those interviews, there was an agreement, and France did agree to pay $60 million to cover people who weren't covered by other Holocaust compensation programs. So I went to this event. It was very interesting. I can tell you about that. So then you think, is it finally over? Right? So now we have the agreement. We put this conflict to bed. We've paid the survivors. The SNCF's name was added to the donor wall of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which was a big deal because they do not put companies up there. There was a big event. I went to there to see that sort of ceremony. And again, trying to say we're an ally. And now the survivors are almost all gone. There's very few left. I just met another one the other day. But I did answer the question about the train drivers. They did all keep their job after the war. And then I wrote the book. At first, this was a dissertation. I made no editorial choices and wrote a 650-page dissertation, which killed my poor advisors. But I just couldn't, I wanted to put everybody's stories in one book. And I couldn't do that, sorry, in my dissertation, but I couldn't do that for a book. So what I did is I just started writing about, I went on a writing residency with other writers, and someone told me, you need to just pick like 4 people or something, 4 that you can really focus on. And I started just writing little vignettes about the people whose stories stuck with me the most. And as I started writing them, I noticed this was really haunting fact that they were all literally on the same train. That by chance, the people whose stories stuck with me were all on the last train from Paris to Auschwitz. That last train left 2.5 months after D-Day. So 2.5 months after those railway workers were sabotaging those trains that were going to help the Allies land, they were still sending trains east to go to the death camps. So you have these trains going in 2 directions. It's just a haunting thing. So what I did in the book is I talk about what's happening with the railway from basically 1938 all the way through 2016, the evolution of this conflict and the different roles it played. But at the end of each chapter, I keep the stories of these people on the last trains and what was their journey at this time, what was happening in their lives. I was getting a lot of challenges with the publisher because some just wanted a straight history, just the facts, and then some just wanted the narratives. And I thought it was really important to keep them together so that when you're reading, you have this experience of head and heart, as we're grappling together with these complexities to help train us to do that. So I wrote the book, and you think the conflict's over. These are some of the folks on that last train that I wrote about. And on that last train, there were 986 adults and 324 children. And you can only imagine what it would have been like to get on this train knowing the Allies had landed. Like literally the war, you can see the war is coming to an end, but you're still being taken. And the other thing was I then found Sarah Federman. I mean, she had been murdered, but I found her I found her niece. And thanks to the Holocaust Museum, they helped me do a special search on the computer. If you ever use the tracing service there, they have a tracing service for the public, but you really need to get somebody who knows how to dig in because it's a complicated system. But I found her. Her brother was pushed into a closet and by the mother, like a weird little door that the Nazis didn't notice, and they took the rest of the family. He ended up becoming a famous writer, Raymond Federman, and he was friends with Foucault and Samuel Beckett, and he's written a number of books. He has since passed away, but I got from his daughter, who is Sarah Federman's niece, this photo. After Raymond, so you can see him there on the left of my screen, he was in hiding, and then when he came back to the apartment, all that was left was a box of photos. So his parents were taken, his sisters were murdered, and this photo was in there. Sarah Federman is on the right, Jacqueline is in the center, his other sister. So it was very haunting to find her at the end of this journey. So now what? Now other railways, so the SNCF conflict is more or less over, but these are transnational movements. Now other railway companies are facing challenges by survivors, the Dutch Railway and the Hungarian Railway. This will not show up in the United States because these railway companies tend not to bid for US contracts, but we are seeing some movement. Then we're seeing corporations participate in other ways in global conflicts, speaking up. This was some airlines during the last administration refusing to carry children separated from their parents. So one of the questions people may ask is whether or not the railway workers refused to drive the trains, and they did not. But I was really happy to see airlines in our era say, no, I don't want to be a part of what's happening here. We also have other legacies and other companies that did horrible things in World War II that I'm still concerned about haven't quite got their moral compass oriented. This is a picture of some forced labor at Volkswagen factory during World War II. And today they have a Uyghur factory in Xinjiang province where they have Uyghur workers. So there's some of that ongoing forced labor. And I've become increasingly interested in this role of corporations in conflict of all kinds. They are surpassing the countries in size. Now, I just compared the market cap of Apple is now bigger than the GDP of India. Blows my mind. Imagine that. The size of Apple is bigger than the GDP of India. It also puts it ahead of France and the UK. Corporations lobby for more rights than obligations. So they're just getting more and more rights, more and more power. They influence diplomacy because so the State Department gets funding through Congress. The lobbying interests affect who's in Congress and what money they get. So one of the jobs of the State Department officials is to support US interests abroad, so they're increasingly influenced. Our State Department officials have to also support these corporations. And companies are involved in all parts of conflict. I mean, they can do a lot of good too. I mean, if we want peace and we want sustainability, we really need their help. But there's just a lot of participation of corporations in politics right now and different global affairs. We see this is a desalination company, like we're going to need their technologies to help us with different challenges. We saw a lot of companies step up after George Floyd's murder, standing up against racial inequity, discrimination, and we still see some of the harm. So Nestle and other companies just can't seem to find a way to source their chocolate that doesn't involve child labor. We have our social media platforms, which are hugely powerful in our era. Facebook finally admitted that it was used to incite the genocide against the Rohingya. And then we have, the gun market and, corporations involved in violence in that way. And of course, I'm sure a lot of you have climate change on your mind, and we have, companies involved in these emissions. So while I started with this railway and just wanting to know if train drivers kept their job, I've become increasingly interested in how we all, just through our own work, the products we buy, find ourselves sort of complicit in these atrocities. Hannah Arendt, if you've had a chance to read her, she talked about this as desk people who are working in business to actually facilitate some of these atrocities, desk murderers. How does someone become a desk murderer? And so there's so many ways in which we all participate in that, oil spills that aren't cleaned up, Chevron. Now we have Exxon suing its own investors who are asking them to report emissions. So there's a lot going on. And we really want to like influence them and I really want Last Train to help influence people today in this next book I'm writing to help corporate executives know how to actually atone for their past so they can make better decisions in the present. So I don't know if any of you have stocks yet. Hopefully you're starting to invest or you'll start to get a retirement plan, but you'll get little votes, little chances to vote actually for some of the shareholder meetings. And I just want to encourage you not to delete those emails, because you can scroll down to the bottom and you're going to see it. It's usually at the bottom after they have all the people on the board. They're going to ask whether or not you support some proposal for some human rights issue or some issue about climate or something about equity, and you'll have a chance to vote. So I just encourage you to vote, not in our elections, our political elections, but also vote in your corporate elections too. They are really important actors. So thank you. I'm really eager for your questions. Those who have read the book, or if you would please write me an Amazon review. I just need to get to 50, and that little algorithm, it's like I have to work for the robot. It'll start to suggest the book to others, because I really want to raise this awareness of the role of businesses in mass atrocity and the ways that we can help influence them to do better. So I look forward to hearing your questions, your comments, your whatever you have to say.
This was amazing. I will remind everyone to please type their questions in the Q&A box. We already have 2 questions. I'll start with those. And History 3676 students, this is always a way for you to participate. And those participation points count. So I'll just go in the order that they're posted, not necessarily in chronological order. But the first is, do you believe that the hero identity of the railway endured because of the propaganda and the way that most people who worked or knew someone who worked there didn't want to believe that the SNCF was bad?
Yeah, it's such a good question. There were strategic ways that the government wanted it to be a site of heroism, but why did it take? There's some funny statistics that, when you get to France, people will tell you very often they had an uncle in the resistance. And someone like did a little statistical estimate and said, well, all those uncles would have like been larger than the size of like, the people in the French army. Like it ended up being more people than was actually accurate. But yeah, like this question's important because we tend to like the stories that make us feel good about ourselves. And why not, And it wasn't untrue that they were in the resistance, but it was so painful. And what ended up happening, and we see this around us all the time, by saying that there was complicity is not to diminish the heroism of those who were so brave. But what's what it feels like? It feels like if you're saying this also happened, you're then saying that those railway workers weren't heroes. But our job as educated people is to be able to hold that cognitive dissonance and to hold multiple truths.
Thank you. That was amazing. And to that person who was an anonymous, if you were a 3676 student, you can always email me to make sure that I knew that you had asked that question. Another question is, would it have been feasible for the SNCF to take responsibility for their actions right after the war had ended, or would it have been too bad for the French national spirit? If so, like if it had been feasible to take responsibility, how could they have done it? And if not, could they have taken responsibility sooner?
Oh, that's such a good question. These are all good questions. So after World War II, there was a period of épuration or purges in France where they tried to remove like people from the police, even some people from the railway who were seen as collaborators. The idea was to get collaborators out of the government so that when they had this new government, they could say, we're not the same. The SNCF was sort of included in that. And it would have been more included, but because of the Union and these connections to Russia, it was sort of complicated. The USSR, there was complicated. They sort of didn't get the full sweep of collaboration. I didn't mention this, but the head of the SNCF during the war was also the head of the Aryanization of Jewish businesses at the time. So he was like full on, like he was appointed to do that, but he was no friend. So that didn't come out. So he could have been punished in another way. It's really interesting to see the Holocaust took a long time to sort of come out. It really took to the 90s for people, 80s, 90s to really talk about it. So about 40 to 50 years. So there was a lot of silence. There was silence with other companies in Germany. So there were some political things that kept the SNCF with many other companies. So they were like many in their silence. I mean, it would have been interesting if they had come up. There was one other piece I want to mention is that the post-Nuremberg trials did try 12 executives. This was the first time we saw executives held accountable for their role in the war. And they were convicted. None of them, though, ended up serving more than 8 years in prison, and they went on to run post-war Europe. But it's very important for corporate accountability. So some executives were actually held accountable after World War II, and the SNCF could have been more a part of that, but they had some ways that they got out of it. Yeah. They were dragged. Like all the things that they did in the end, they did because they were dragged into it, but they did it. And now they're a model for, I think, for other companies.
These questions are just awesome, and hopefully you will enjoy them as much as I am as they're kind of coming in. The next question is, how popular is the perspective of it's just picking a new perpetrator since all the SNCF workers of the time period are dead among the survivors today?
Yeah. So the idea of this idea of kind of going after a perpetrator now that all the perpetrators are dead. You probably study this idea of lieu de mémoire or memory sites. So the reason the railway comes up is that it's a moving lieu de mémoire. When the train is in your town and your family was deported or you were deported on that train, you are seeing it and you are reminded of it. And so there was something about the trains that felt so unsettling for people. So yes, while there's so many, the individuals were dead, the haunting nature of that railway kept it in people's consciousness. It was also it was really where their identities ended. As soon as they were in that rail car, nobody survived those gas chambers. So we don't know what it was like, but we know what the rail car was like. People survived that and they told that story. So I get chills even talking about it, but there is a way in which it's so symbolic of the whole thing, the dehumanization, the suffering, the loss of light and water and sanitation. And so that makes it this moving lieu de mémoire. So I think that's what makes it, these lawsuits continue on. There's an unsettledness. Also, the way that our machines turned against us. I mean, we start to think about that with AI. There's some interesting links between railways and that. Yeah. Concerns about that.
You mentioned earlier, this is the next question, that you worked for a corporation prior to being stationed in France for work. Do you think corporations can see the role they play, whether that be as a hero or a victim or a perpetrator in real time?
Oh, you have such great students.
Don't I have the best students ever? Aren't you jealous?
Oh my gosh, these are such good questions. One of the things I noticed working in business is that you're so busy and stressed about all you have to do that I remember even saying, like, how are people even angry about anything in the world? I don't have time to be angry about politics, about this, about that. I'm just trying to like move. Corporations are just like moving you, moving you, moving you. And so you're not really thinking. It's easy not to like look at how the little piece you're doing connects to something larger. I ended up leaving advertising because there were just some I just don't think the world needs more Diet Coke. Like, nothing against Diet Coke, I like Coke Zero, but I just was like, there were some things for me that I don't want to do that. I don't want to keep helping this with my education. I think it's hard to see. I think one, it's hard to see because of your job individually. Then the second reason it can be hard to see is that you end up working in a large corporation with other people doing the same thing. So I took my students, we were supposed to meet with Exxon. We went across the country on a train, made a train class. It was amazing in May. And we stopped in Houston where Exxon was going to meet with us, and they canceled last minute. And it was interesting though to still meet other people in the oil industry, because everybody who's in the industry is in the industry together. And so, they're not evil people individually. I mean, we're all using the products from fossil fuels. We're all part of it. But when you're in a group that's all in it together, you don't see it either. So I think it's really interesting to be in big companies. And I think some we know. I mean, I think sometimes we know the products we're using, the things we're investing in aren't great. And then we tell ourselves, we make reasons, why we should do it. I mean, the amount you can make in Houston in the oil industry when you graduate is really hard for a lot of people to turn away from. It's a lot of money compared to being a professor or other things. Yeah. But I don't think all corporations have to be evil, or that working in a corporation makes you evil. I think it's important to be in there and help guide them.
I think that's really helpful. And one of the first sets of readings we did was sort of Heifetz Linsky thinking about adaptive versus technical. And part of one of the characteristics of adaptive leadership is that ability to kind of get up onto the balcony and look at the dance floor, even when you're in that sort of fast moving space.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
That's a
Yeah.
great reminder. The next question, something we've been talking about in class, is the need for leaders to make decisions after taking many different perspectives and ideas into account. The SNCF conflict is one such issue with numerous complexities and contradicting viewpoints. Based on your experience looking into the conflict, what advice would you give to us as emerging leaders who may one day need to make decisions after hearing many different viewpoints?
Oh, so good. Well, I just want to say you're already leaders. You're trying to deal with many different viewpoints because you're making decisions every day that matters. So you're already there. The SNCF executives, it was interesting to see how they were handling it. If you can honor complexity and think about it, you're gonna have to think about your legacy when you're done, not just the moment, because in the moment, there's such a desire. I hate, who likes criticism? You just want to look good. You want to please your constituents. And so it's so difficult to look ahead and to say, okay, how do I want to be remembered? How do I want my kids or grandkids to see how I handled this moment? And in the moment, I think that's really hard. One of the things that does help, and your answer was in your question, which is staying connected to the different parties. And when you stay connected to the different parties, they stay in your consciousness. And when they stay in your consciousness as real people, not just ideas or perspectives, when you care about the railway workers who, had a grandfather in the resistance, and you care about the survivors, and you care about the employees who work there today and how they feel about their company, and how France's, the importance of French trains in the world, when you can hold all of those as people and as real, your answers will be more holistic, and you won't have to cut part of yourself off. But it's the staying connected. It's so hard not to take these things personally, because it feels like it's the executives that were in charge of dealing with this. By the way, the company was very strategic. They put Jewish executives in charge of this on purpose to try to build some peace. But it was really complicated for them to play these multiple roles.
Yeah, thank you. And I know there are a couple of people on the webinar who are not 3676 students, but we had a few weeks ago John Pepper, the former CEO of Procter and Gamble, and he also talked about kind of legacy and thinking about constituents as real people. So that was really lovely to hear.
That's very good to hear.
Yeah. So the next question: to what level did the fear of personal Nazi retribution influence the actions of SNCF leaders?
This is great. So the executives, this happened a lot during World War II. You may have seen an article by Robert Paxton come out in the New York Times last week. But Paxton is the one who really opened up France to its own collaboration during World War II, because they had this story about being a victim and being in the resistance. And what he showed is how many people use the occupation as an advantage, as an opportunity to advance their careers. So I do just want to say, a number of people used it, like Eichmann, who was like a car salesman or something, right? Like uses it and like launches. So I do want to be clear that people in the upper echelons were not facing death, and a number of them collaborated with great gusto. Not all, but a number really did. So, and I'm sure this is as true in every other place there's conflict in the world. I don't want to say there's something wrong with the French, like this happens everywhere. The railway workers in the Union were paid not very much to do a very dangerous job, and they were on the front lines, and they were afraid of being shot or so one of the survivors I interviewed, he's like, wait, like we wanted them to take a bullet for us, but we weren't willing to leave the line and take a bullet for ourselves, like take a bullet ourselves. You know, he's like, it's not really fair. Like we're asking them to take that risk. So there were some railway workers who sabotaged a train that ended up killing 9 Germans or something, or maybe even more German soldiers. And the German soldiers went into the town, because the whole town was SNCF workers, and shot all the people in their beds. I mean, there was retribution, and it was a very scary time. One person refused to drive a train of German soldiers, and nothing happened to him. He was just sent to southern France to work in another office. So you thought maybe, and I don't know if word traveled, but maybe they could have refused to drive the trains without being killed. But it was a scary time, and I think it's really hard to imagine the amount of insecurity of being occupied and the lack of food. So I loved hearing, and they're more in the book, and I didn't get to share them, but the beautiful stories of the little ways they tried to help people. Like a whole town in Lille, the railway workers got people to pass their babies like through like a rail car, and like saved all these people that this individual just found these histories. He found them at like a I don't know, like a flea market. He like started to put together and found that they had done this. So there's a lot of beautiful ways that people help in times of war that may not make it to the front pages.
And the next, and I'm really going by order, but this is such a nice segue to what you were just talking about. The next question is, was it an emotional experience talking to survivors or the family members of survivors that made it difficult at times to continue research?
Oh my God. Oh my God. I was just in despair. Like 90 people. And you're not gonna like say no, and you're not gonna cut them off, and they're gonna tell you what they're gonna tell you. I didn't even need to hear about their Holocaust experience. I just wanted to know about the trains, but they wanted to tell me the whole thing. And I finished the interviews, and there was a faculty member who wasn't even my advisor. She walked by me and said, "How's it going? How's it going?" And I said, "Oh, I finished the interviews. I'm okay." And she goes, "Well, have you read what you've written yet? Like, have you worked with them?" And I said, "No." And she goes, "Yeah, no. So that's when it really is going to hit you." She said, "I'm going to keep checking on you and just see how you're doing. And please come to me." And I was just, and even now, like when you ask that, I can feel it in my heart. Like I just spoke, I was just invited to speak at a Salam Shalom sisterhood where Muslim and Jewish women are together, working together right now, trying to find a way forward in peace. And I was sharing with them some of the stories of the Holocaust survivors that they taught me about war. I mean, because they told me all kinds of things that I didn't expect to hear. And even just their stories, like living inside me. So yeah, I feel that it was devastating at times. And you think, this is also for you researchers out there, you think, listen, I didn't even live it, so like I should just be able to take it. And I did learn from my sister, who's a criminologist, that you can get PTSD from listening to stories. So I do want you all, like, if you're doing this research and you have good hearts, if you're in this program, like that, like you get to kind of watch yourself, see how you're doing. One of them said to me, he kind of saw me crying as he's talking, and he's like, "Well, you picked a tough subject, but as bad as you think it was actually worse." And another one said, "Oh, actually, I think it's worse to try to imagine Auschwitz than live it." And I was like, "Well, I don't think that's true." But yeah, absolutely. But it's like right now in this time, and with all the things that are happening in the world, I actually feel there's strength with me. So there was a gift that came with it.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And I completely agree. I often at sort of Holocaust studies conferences, I feel like it's part scholarship, part, therapy group where we're all kind of sharing how hard it is, right, to be kind of the vessel that holds these stories. The next question is, did the SNCF help inspire other corporations who may have had dealings with the Nazis to atone for their previous actions?
I asked them exactly that question. I said, so is your phone ringing off the hook? Don't people want to know how to handle this? And they said, well, not so at the time. They had said not so much. I do wonder though if the Dutch and Hungarians railways have reached out specifically in their industry. I ended up writing a piece for the Harvard Business Review on how corporations should atone, highlighting them. And so that, I think it actually got them in a little bit of trouble and they were mad at me. But what I said was not untrue. But I think they may have gotten more information, like requests after that. And I hope this next book too, because I do think they learned a lot. Like they made some mistakes, but I really want to reiterate, like they were gracious with me. I was American. Who am I to like be in there? So I want to applaud them for that. And now, and those of you who are studying slavery as well, that's been my new area, sort of looking at what about corporations that had a role in slavery or banks that gutted Haiti. There's a lot of examples.
So the next question feeds nicely into that. Do you think that larger corporations are able to operate in a completely moral way in this day and age with the amount of demand that there is without massively transferring those costs to consumers? And also, how much responsibility is transferred to consumers when we know that companies have unethical sourcing or are supporting bad things?
All right, you all just need to be in power right now. These are like the best questions. I was thinking as you were saying that, yeah, I mean, I love that, and it's so important you understand like how much gets passed to the consumer. We went to a fossil fuel exhibit in Houston to see how that was funded by the fossil fuel industry. That passes all conservation onto the consumer and none onto them. It's really interesting the way they do it. Like, you are the answer. But I was thinking just between waking up and coming to this computer, all the things I was complicit in. I mean, I like I mean, I don't know where this sweater came from, the lithium in this computer. I think my coffee was ethically sourced, but like, who knows what's in my water filter? So I think the complexity and the questions that you're asking are just the ones we have to keep asking, and how we can lean us in a better direction, right? Be conscientious and not just say, okay, they're evil. Like, it's really easy for me because sometimes certain corporations make these decisions and I'm like, okay, I really want to hate y'all right now. But in some ways I'm complicit in those products too. So I want to just say like, holding that, like, yes, they're accountable. I want them to, we're talking about making a corporate legacy index so they can start thinking about how their legacy is going to be over time. I think it's B Corps are trying to help companies do as much good as they can. And we see like Dr. Bronner's, Taylor Guitars, like there's some small companies that are trying to be, but when you're the size of Procter and Gamble, like, I don't know how you just like hit a home run every day. I mean, there's just so much in those different products and the waste with them. And, it's complicated. I do think there are obviously some that are worse than others. And you can find those out very, very quickly. So if you do end up working in business, find one that you feel that you can at least listens to you talk about values or includes it. And if you work in one that doesn't, I hope you can learn a lot from it and then work in one that you feel better about.
Did any of the deportees you interviewed speak English, or was all of your interviewing in French? Did you ever feel like there was a language barrier where you had trouble understanding parts of the story?
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I was about half and half French, half English. And then I started to get some letters from Poland. And I had to actually there was a man working at the House of Representatives who was in charge of this issue, who actually I ended up working with him on it, but he spoke Polish. So I bring him the letters and we would read them together. And it was like a really beautiful thing to like bond over like the individual stories. Absolutely, language wise, like sometimes they would tell stories in a way in French. And I was like, what? I don't even like, the language was sort of different because they were speaking like a 1940s, sometimes. But my language still did get better. Yeah. Yeah, the language part is tough. Because also you think you know what someone's saying, and there's like, okay, did I get the words? Check, but did I get the meaning? And I'm American, like I also of a different generation, so like I don't always know. That's why with the ones that you see in the book, I met with multiple times and developed relationships with them. So there was more rapport, so I got to see the larger context, not just like a one-off interview where I'm like scribbling, although that had to happen sometimes. Yeah, but
How did
don't
the
hesitate. I just want to encourage, if whoever that was, if you're nervous about research, like just do it. Like go, do your best. Yeah.
learn languages? That's also
Yeah.
good. How did the non-Jews respond to your active research? You mentioned that you were told to tread lightly.
Oh, yeah. Oh, so when I snuck into that SNCF conference, people were asking who I was, because I was just like standing at the cocktail hour. And one, and I just told them, and one guy said, I'll tell you, he got so red. He was a tall guy, young guy. I'll tell you one thing, I'm Jewish and I work at the SNCF and I'm very proud. And he stormed off. And then others just sort of moved away when they heard my topic. I was dating in France at the time. And some of those dates were a little bit awkward when people were asking what I was studying. But I would say for the most part, people were good about it. Yeah, I did not face a lot of like, and kind of anti-Semitic. I didn't, in that context. No, people were pretty good. I saw more defensiveness within the Jewish community, actually, sometimes. Yeah, it's interesting.
That is interesting. If there was one overarching lesson or message that you would hope readers take away from The Last Train to Auschwitz, what would that be?
Hmm. Hmm. That in the end, what we all have is choice in our lives. That's what it is. Like we can't choose the contexts that are happening around us, but the choices that we make matter. And I want to say this was the one of the messages I got. You're not going to be able to stop all the things that are happening, but the little things you do and the care that you express for people who are going through them that you can't help matters. The Holocaust survivors remembered every nice thing said to them, glass of water handed to them on the way to their, like a torture, like they remember it. And so if we can, there can be so much guilt when you start to realize, oh my God, we're all these terrible things we're doing. And that can be overwhelming. But to find that little piece where you do have choice, and you had choice to do this program, you had choice to come here today. So that's exercising that choice. But your choice is big or small. They matter. And I thought that was really encouraging.
We have still so many questions, but I'm just plucking out one, and then because I do want to be sensitive to everyone's time. When researching or going around to business or organizations, what do you think is the best or most effective apology method or strategy you've seen work well to address victims or situations?
Awesome. I have a whole chapter coming out just on that. Yeah, like what the heck is a good apology, right? And this is a tricky one because when corporations, okay, first of all, you don't just throw it to your PR department unless they really understand historical harm, because PR is more like, we're sorry that your blender broke. Like or like we have defective blenders. It's like really different defective blenders from like we've helped incinerate, tens of thousands of people. So one, you want to have a more thoughtful group. I want to just acknowledge there's always a double bind for corporations, where that means they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. So if they don't apologize, they're seen as heartless. If they do apologize, they're seen as just doing it for their image. So I do think it's important as people watching these apologies to understand that suspicion will always be there. So the apology research I have done, there's been great people who've written about apologies. A great apology has a few elements, and I'll just tell you what they are if you want to write them down, because they are just as effective in your personal life. One is that you acknowledged fully what the harm was. You know, I smashed your car, you know, I deported the people. Like, what did you do? The impact of that action. So not hiding exactly, saying that you acknowledge it, the impact that as you understand it, what you're going to do to rectify that impact, to address that. Sometimes we forget that. We're like, sorry, I crashed your car, but we don't like fix the car, right? So that impact, and then what you're going to do going forward to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's a full apology. It does not include asking for forgiveness, because now you're giving those who were harmed more work to do, because now they have to somehow forgive you and absolve you. What's great to do when you give an apology like this before you do it publicly is you talk to those who have been harmed and say, did we get that right? Before I do it publicly, am I articulating the harm fully? Am I articulating the impact fully? Now, the company might not want to say, not say everything that they're told to say, but like, make sure, like, did I hear that right? Am I getting it? And when those are done, like the Baltimore Sun did such a beautiful apology for its role in racial inequity, full page, and they go through this. They do all these steps. So they have a very good example if you want to see. Jacques Chirac in France did a beautiful apology in 1995. Was that when it was? For France's role. He owned it 100%. And it's still the French people. It's interesting. Talk about like, did people push back on my research? They love that apology. People would just tell me how much they appreciated it. I mean, Jew, non-Jew, didn't matter. It was beautiful. So those are the two that I would look at right now. Yeah, for corporations to do, to have those 4 elements.
Thank you so much, Dr. Federman. This was an amazing lecture. The Q&A was nuanced and just really exciting and robust. I hope everyone joins me in sort of the virtual clap of thanking you, and thanks everyone for attending. I really appreciated spending time with everyone this morning.
Thank you. I've given a lot of talks, and I think these were the best questions I've ever had. So go you, just keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.